Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Miller, and I'm the Executive Director of the American Economic Liberties Project. Thank you so much for joining us for this event. We're really excited to co-host it with our partners, Groundwork Collaborative and the American Prospect. Over the next hour, we'll be unpacking the market power problems at the root of our systemic supply chain vulnerabilities and lifting up ways to rebuild a more resilient system. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic and now Russia's invasion of Ukraine are making clear the urgent need to reimagine where and how we produce and move the goods that families and our economy need to thrive. American consumers and businesses are dealing with acute product shortages and devastating price hikes on everything from baby formula to semiconductors, which has exposed just how vulnerable American families and society at large are to shocks around the world. Policymakers in the administration and Congress are responding in ways we're going to discuss during the event, but one individual who has been on a mission to strengthen supply chains long before most people realized there was even a problem is Senator Tammy Baldwin. For years, Senator Baldwin has been a strong advocate for Buy American procurement and revitalizing U.S. manufacturing overall. As a leader on legislation like the Supply Chain Resiliency Act, Senator Baldwin has fought for shoring up productive capacity here in the U.S. to ensure that we can create good jobs, support innovation, and build things we need. Senator Baldwin will be in conversation with Dave Dan, who, as I'm sure this audience knows, is the author of the excellent book Monopolized and the executive editor of the American Prospect. Simply put, Dave's writing and the Prospect's reporting is the most substantive and insightful work out there on politics, power, and the economy. This event came together to help bring to life the most recent issue of the Prospect, which was published in partnership with Groundwork and focused exclusively on the problems monopoly power is causing in supply chains across a range of industries. So please pick that up if you've not already. Now I want to turn it over to Dave and Senator Baldwin to dive into the conversation and kick off the event. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And thanks for all the work that your group does at the American Economic Liberties Project. I'm Dave Dan. I'm the executive editor of the American Prospect. As Sarah mentioned, we just did a very long report in conjunction with Groundwork Collaborative. You can find every one of those stories at prospect.org/supply chain. And I'm excited today to be speaking with Senator Baldwin about these very important issues. So let's get right into it. Senator Baldwin, in the wake of the war in Ukraine, I see all these members of Congress talking about how we have to produce American energy at home to assure we aren't exposed to shocks that we can't control. And my question is, why don't we ever see the same logic apply for the rest of the supply chain? Do you see any movement on that with your colleagues?
Yeah, so actually, I do. And I would say, in the wake of the pandemic, there was an enormous discussion that went on about the fact that we were unable to supply ourselves with made in America products, what we needed to protect ourselves. Whether that was masks or gowns or gloves or tests and reagents and swabs. I mean, the list goes on. And we didn't solve the problem then, although I think we identified it in more detail. Just like today, we are having the discussion about energy and where we go after Putin's aggressions and his invasion of Ukraine and our appropriately ending Russian oil imports has resulted in gas spikes. And I will just note on that, we have to put a lot of options on the table, but I have joined bipartisan legislation, mostly with senators from the heartland, about filling some of the gap that remains from cutting off Russian oil imports with homegrown biofuels.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I know there's an issue with in your home state with regard to the postal fleet that we were supposed to get electrified, but apparently not, as the Oshkosh Defense, which is in Wisconsin, moved its production down to South Carolina for labor reasons, and also is giving us a problem with respect to the energy aspect of it. So that seems like it's part and parcel with some of these issues we're talking about.
Yeah, let me say a little bit about that. I've been following closely the competition among a number of uh, uh, companies to get that contract from the U.S. Postal Service. And frankly, I was just overjoyed when I heard that Oshkosh Defense had won that contract. And I remember there's a new CEO there. I remember being on the phone, our first conversation, and just congratulating him on this incredible news when he revealed that he wasn't sure where these vehicles were going to be produced. And I thought, well, if not in Oshkosh, then elsewhere in Wisconsin, right? And then, several weeks later, I learned about this move to South Carolina, and I know that part of their getting this contract rested upon the expert workforce they have that knows how to work with the federal government, that knows how to put together very sophisticated vehicles. So that was one big disappointment. But the other thing from the very outset was why the U.S. Postal Service was only asking for a 10% electric vehicle fleet. When we have a new president who said all our federal fleet should be 100% EV as we move forward and make investments. And so I haven't let go of either of those issues yet. I want to see a much higher percentage of these U.S. postal vehicles be electric vehicles. And I also want to assure that that the workforce that builds these, our union workforce, and have the expertise, which in my mind means making them in Wisconsin.
It's great. Well, I mean, this is it seems tangential, but it's exactly what we're talking about. So for years, we've had companies chase cheaper labor. Usually what that meant is they chased it abroad. They centralized production in other parts of the world and concentrated manufacturing operations, put a lot of pressure on the supply chains and the various nodes along those chains to produce. And then any disruptions get very magnified. And I'm wondering how businesses in Wisconsin are feeling these issues, how the delays and the higher prices have impacted small businesses and manufacturing within your state. What are you hearing?
Yeah, and I just, before I answer, I also want to just, the context you laid out was really, really important, because I think, in the early years, decades ago, we saw the industry move from the northern parts of the USA to the southern parts of the USA. And then with NAFTA, we saw jobs move to Mexico. And then with allowing China into the WTO, by the way, I voted against that, we saw jobs go even further away. And so, and then, of course, with a pandemic and with a war in Ukraine and all of these very, very serious events, we're suffering from the supply chain issues. So believe it or not, the supply chain breakdown is the number one issue facing Wisconsin businesses. And I'm not just talking about retailers, it's manufacturers who can't get the inputs they need for putting together their products. And the Wisconsin's Manufacturing Extension Partnership commissioned a study to gauge Wisconsin manufacturers and perceptions of the state of their business and get their outlook on manufacturing. They did this back last fall, and their top issue was the supply chain. Manufacturers either can't get their products or their inputs, or they're paying exorbitant amounts to get them. Yeah. And I want to say, honestly, this came as quite a shock to me, because so many of my manufacturers in Wisconsin have been talking to me as their top priority used to be labor force shortages. And the fact that this has now become number one is really something for us to pay attention to. And I'm not saying that the labor issues are resolved. I just want to say that supply chain issues have become so pervasive that they now supplant the workforce issues, according to most of our Wisconsin manufacturers. Mm-hmm. And what makes this all the more frustrating is that there's a lot of demand for the products they make. And so if they were only able to get their inputs, they would be selling into a very hot market right now. And I would just also say that while we have manufactured products that can't get in, Wisconsin's agricultural exporters are having a particularly difficult time getting their products out with transport via ocean shipping and freight rail.
Yeah, this is a key point that it is more efficient, more cost, more profitable for these ocean shipping companies to move back empty containers to Asia rather than ship actual goods from exporters in the United States to Asia. This is a huge issue, and I know that it's being worked on in Congress. One thing you've often talked about, which I appreciate, is the role of Wall Street in dictating business decisions. And how do you think they're responsible for some of these issues that we're talking about right now, whether it's demanding lower labor costs from companies, demanding deregulation, which has led to a lot of capacity shortages on things like rail and trucking, and just other factors that have shaped our brittle supply chains?
Yeah. Well, you're right. This is an issue I've focused a lot on, how Wall Street uses its power to influence corporate decision-making. And I think a lot of the blame for the supply chain crisis really lies there. Investors can be very effective at using stock-based pay to convince executives to do what it is they want. Mm-hmm. Wall Street has an ideology that demands that companies cut investment and distribute cash to shareholders. The hope is that these companies get a stock price increase, at least in the very short term. And this let's downsize and distribute playbook is often justified as efficiency or capital discipline. But the crisis has revealed that these strategies are simply short-sighted and really, really greedy. So corporate governance reforms and more empowered workers are really what's needed to change the incentives in corporate boardrooms and counteract Wall Street. The idea that we put workers on the board, or at least let workers elect a share of the board, I think would really, really impact decision making.
That's great. Making the connection between corporate governance and these supply chain issues is really key. So you have this bill called the Supply Chain Resiliency Act. I believe there are sort of portions of it or a version of it in the House competitiveness bill. Could you tell us what the Resiliency Act would do and how it could help with these problems?
Yeah. So I am pleased to talk a little bit about the Supply Chain Resiliency Act, which I do think addresses a lot of the problems we're talking about. And you're right. Some of the provisions are included in the House Competes Act, and I'm hoping that once we go to conference on that bill, we're going to be able to keep them. But here's what it does: the bill requires a new Office of Supply Chain Resiliency at the Commerce Department to do forward-looking analysis that anticipates what products we need and what are susceptible or vulnerable to shortages. So it's kind of like the old stress tests we used to do on banks. This is stress testing that will help inform what support the Office of Supply Chain Resiliency will be able to provide. And ultimately, we hope that this support will take the form of grants and loans or loan guarantees to domestic manufacturers to expand their production of critical products. And currently, there's $45 billion in the House Competes Act for this type of support, which is fantastic. And lastly, one of the provisions that is in my legislation that I hope to push for is strong labor protections. The underinvestment that made our supply chains brittle is not just limited to physical assets, but also human assets like our workforce. And we've seen many companies with unionized workers do better during this crisis than companies without unionized workers. And that's because to keep a steady supply of workers, you need to respect the dignity of work and treat them right and pay them well. And a union helps ensure that.
Absolutely. We just have a minute, so I'll make this the last question. I mean, ultimately, and it sort of goes to what you were talking about, one way to relieve pressure on supply chains is produce critical goods right here in the United States. You've been a champion on Buy America procurement policies. And what can we be done there, and how can we fix the loopholes in the current policies that would make that work better?
Yeah, so there's many loopholes, by the way, in the current policies. We have waivers that have been granted by administrations past just to allow federal agencies to bypass the Buy America requirements. And I'm not sure that these waivers have been granted in a thoughtful, a thorough manner. Perhaps it's just a rubber stamp. Oh, we waived it before, we'll waive it again. The Biden administration has really pledged to both make the waivers transparent. We'll have a database on a website that we can see, but also the Biden administration, we hope, is going to grant a lot fewer of these. But the idea of having a transparent a database will also allow us to allow small, medium-sized businesses, manufacturers to scrutinize that and say, oh, we could make that piece, that part, that component, and maybe retool to reshore these vulnerable supply chains that go thousands of miles overseas, right? So I think we have a real opportunity through addressing the loopholes to bring more jobs back. Now, that's certainly not the only issue we deal with, but that's a big step forward to address Buy America loopholes.
That's great. Well, Senator Baldwin, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And it's been great talking with you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
All right. And I believe now we are going to move to the next part of our program, and we are going to bring in Rakeen Mahbood with Groundwork Collaborative, who's been pretty much everywhere. So I'm not surprised she's here as well, and doing really great work on these very important issues. So Rakeen, take it away.
Thanks, David. It's great to see you, and huge gratitude to the American Prospect and to the American Economic Liberties Project for being such great partners in this work. And I'm so excited to continue and to dive deeper into this incredibly rich conversation that David and Senator Baldwin kicked off for us. So my name is Rakeen Mahbood. I'm the Chief Economist and Managing Director of the Groundwork Collaborative. And today, I'm really excited to deepen this conversation with our exceptional panel. So let me introduce the wonderful folks you'll be hearing from today. First up, we'll have Dr. Charmaine Chua, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Global Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her research and teaching interests are in technologies of globalization, global political economy, infrastructure studies, empire and imperialism, and ocean studies. Dr. Chua's research is concerned with the politics of global circulation, how things move, how movement is regulated, disrupted, or facilitated, and why systems that are supposed to provision life might actually distribute inequality and death. Next up, we'll welcome Todd Spencer, who is the president and owner-operator of the Independent Drivers Association. Todd has testified before various committees of the U.S. Congress on trucking issues. He has also served on various committees in the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance as an industry representative, as well as an industry advisor to the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration and the National Transportation Safety Board. Next up, we have Mike Beckham, who is the CEO and co-founder of Simple Modern. Simple Modern is one of the leading suppliers of stainless steel insulated drinkware in the world. Simple Modern has an omni-channel consumer packaged goods company that was built from a digital-first distribution strategy and is a licensing partner for the NFL, NBA, NCAA, and Disney. Mike lives in Norman, Oklahoma, and is the senior entrepreneur in residence for the University of Oklahoma Price College of Business Entrepreneurship Program. And last but certainly not least, we have Matt Buck, who is a senior fellow at the American Economic Liberties Project. He is also currently a first-year student at Yale Law School. He has written or co-written opinion pieces for the Washington Monthly Online, ProMarket, and the New York Times, as well as a book chapter with Sandeep Vaheesan on antitrust and labor for inequality in the labor market. He's also working on a forthcoming article on non-compete clauses and work arrangements for the Michigan State Law Review. So please join me in welcoming our wonderful panel, and we will dive right in. So Dr. Chua, I want to start with you. You have done a ton of research into the ways that goods move around in a globalized economy. So I was hoping you might start by telling us a little bit about the just-in-time supply chain, what it is, and why it really results in such fragility in our systems.
Happy to, and very happy to be here, Rakeem. So I guess I would start with saying that, from everywhere from the stucking of the Ever Given ship in the Suez Canal last year to price shocks on gas and oil, we've started to see that every interruption to the supply chain has this kind of knock-on effect on other components. And that's no coincidence. The supply chain, at least since the 1970s, and so over the last 50 years, has really been designed to be lean, tightly calibrated, and in perpetual motion. Really where the idea of just-in-time initially came from was Taiichi Ohno, an engineer at Toyota in the 1950s, who was inspired by the work of Henry Ford and defined just-in-time as an idea of eliminating waste of all sorts, by which he meant stockpiles, extra workers, unused minutes in the production and movement of goods. And so the language of just-in-time has this kind of innocuous tone to it, but really what it does is insist on an idea in which anything that is seen as not efficient should be seen as sort of extraneous to that system. And so over the years, as this kind of just-in-time model has been exported out of the car plant and into all kinds of goods and service production, what it has done is forced its way down every supply chain, increased competition, forced companies to reduce costs. And over time, that has really resulted as a result of both the deregulation of the 1970s in the US, as well as these kinds of price pressures, a kind of consolidation and monopoly. So what we start to see in the kind of current supply chain crisis is that the links in the supply chain that we so rely on now are owned by the private sector. And that private sector has become highly consolidated, whether it's across food distribution or commercial distribution in things like Amazon or in Cisco products. And so the kind of litany of anti-competitive tactics like mergers and exclusive contracts have created these kinds of consolidations that have made it so that an already stretched system that requires this kind of tight calibration is further affected by the kind of increased concentration of factories, trucks, so on and so forth, all of which are sort of increasingly concentrated and consolidated. So I'll just end with two kind of ways in which I think this is important to keep in mind with the supply chain crisis in the current moment. One, which is infrastructure. Decades of underinvestment have meant that the infrastructure is incredibly sort of fragile and not able to respond to the kind of short-term and immediate shortages that are currently happening. So in the ports, you have increased dwell times because automation is not able to unload ships efficiently. In the ports and railroads, underinvestment has created a crumbling infrastructure. But the final one that I want to point out is that communication across these supply chains has been a big factor. What typically, what we are experiencing is a sort of supply chain that has never been more algorithmically tracked and traced. The problem is, as the American Prospect writer Robert Kuttner has pointed out, that these are treated as kind of proprietary informations. And so the ways in which we are able to track the supply chain are held sort of tightly to the chest by different kinds of business owners, such that communication across that supply chain is kind of withheld. And so we don't have the information that we need to be able to know when goods are arriving here and there. But I'll stop there and hand it over to other people.
Thank you. I mean, there's so much in those comments that I'm eager to explore. And what really strikes me is relates to the last point that Senator Baldwin made, which is that when you turn your supply chain over to these big private actors, they are beholden to their shareholders, right? They're not beholden to building a resilient system. And unfortunately, with the pandemic and with other supply shocks that are likely coming, that means we end up with bottlenecks and shortages. And I know, Matt, I'll turn to you next. You've written a little bit about this in your recent piece in the American Prospect. You write about our rail system. It's just a critical part of our supply chain. So I was wondering if you could dig into a little bit the just-in-time dynamics that Dr. Chua was talking about and just how it shows up in our rail system.
Sure. Yeah. And thank you all for having me today. And, something I want to kind of emphasize at the outset is that COVID-19 didn't make railroads or supply chains brittle. I think COVID and the accompanying demand shocks really revealed how fragile corporations and financiers have made our supply chains. And I think the deregulation of the freight railroad industry and its contribution to supply chain problems kind of illustrates a lot of what Senator Baldwin and Professor Chua were talking about. In my Prospect article, I wrote about how railroad deregulation in the 70s and 1980 relaxed a lot of the obligations that the railroads had to serve the public. And I think you see this, there's kind of two kind of big developments since deregulation in 1980. And these are kind of rampant consolidation and then the railroad's own kind of version of what you might call just-in-time that they call precision scheduled railroading, or PSR. So before deregulation, railroads had certain public obligations that date back to the Progressive era and even the Populist Gilded Age, including non-discrimination. They had to post their prices publicly and openly, and a kind of minimum service obligation to a lot of the country because railroading is an essential infrastructure. But with the rise of freight trucking and also regulators caught a little flat-footed with the kind of post-war logistics networks, the Carter administration ended up deregulating a lot of the industry. And the railroad industry was kind of struggling at the time. But with deregulation, we basically took a lot of those public responsibilities away from the railroads and then subsequently led to a kind of merger wave, really two merger waves in the 1980s and 1990s. At the start of deregulation in 1980, there were 40 Class 1 railroads, which are the biggest railroads that kind of do most of the shipping in the country. Today, there are 7. And in reality, there's really only 2 sets of 2 duopolies because there's only 2 railroads that really serve most customers west of Chicago, Union Pacific and BNSF. And there's only 2 that serve most customers east of Chicago, CSX and Norfolk Southern. And even further, kind of many stations, I think most even according to some shipper groups, are only served by one monopolist. And one thing I want to also emphasize here is that, in an era in the 1980s and 1990s where the antitrust agencies were really permissive about merger policy, the railroad regulator, the Surface Transportation Board, actually happened to be more permissive. So whereas the antitrust agencies would say, essentially, depending on the type of administration, if it got down to 2 or 3 companies remaining in a market, that was fine. The railroad regulators would say, if it gets down to just 2, that's fine. But then we'll stop it at monopolies, but that's it. And so once railroads kind of amassed a ton of power in the 1980s and 1990s by consolidating, in the mid 2000s and late 2000s and early 2010s, they started to use that power, started to kind of exercise it. And they started to use this PSR model that Wall Street investment funds, most notably financiers like Bill Ackman and Paul Hilal, kind of pushed, most notably CSX, but then really the rest of the industries to start adopting in the middle of the last decade. And all railroads implemented some type of PSR, and only BNSF doesn't call it that. But PSR is basically this just-in-time program where railroads focus on keeping costs low and profits high. And they do this by running kind of faster, longer trains, cutting service to a lot of areas, cutting down on workers, safety, and a lot of workers have been actually raising the alarm about this. One told this Vice investigation it's going to end up like Boeing, with Boeing's kind of crashes, because there's stories of workers who only have like a minute to inspect a car, or even being told not to inspect a car just so that they can meet these PSR metrics and make the railroad just work faster. And so all of this culminates in a brittle supply chain that kind of does cascade throughout the rest of the supply chain and driving up costs for businesses. And, despite this all, and this is kind of the kicker, is that, despite the kind of struggles that Class 1 railroads had last year, the stock price of all Class 1 railroads rose by the end of the year, and sometimes as much as by 20%. So ultimately, I do think that what Dr. Chua was just talking about can be seen in a range of industries, but especially so in rail.
Thanks for that, Matt. And it's just fascinating, right? Because I think we're seeing a lot of the similar dynamics you were just talking about across a range of industries right now. The CPI numbers just came out today. They're record highs, and we still see corporate profit margins at a record high. So all of these companies are really making, frankly, a lot of bank off of this particular moment of crisis. So for all of you who are watching on the YouTube feed, just a reminder that you can submit your questions into the comments. So please feel free to do so as we continue this conversation. And Todd, I wanted to turn to you next. I think before I started digging into this issue, in my head, supply chains were like, I pictured it as these giant iron links, right? Like these big machines, these big cranes, and big objects, big container ships. But workers are such a critical part of our making sure that our supply chain functions, and really making sure all of those links function smoothly. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how supply chain fragility affects independent truck drivers and through your experience in this work.
I'm certainly going to try. My name is Todd Spencer. I'm the president of the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association. We're a trade association that was started almost 50 years ago, ironically, as a result of the very first Arab oil embargo that created havoc across the country, but it largely shut down trucking, especially small business truckers are like the people that we represent. And, ironically, then as well as now, most of trucking is made up of these small businesses. At any rate, the founders of OIDA trooped off to DC to convince that if they had a day or two with lawmakers, they get all these problems worked out. And of course, here we are almost 50 years later, still focusing on many of those. I started myself in the 1970s driving truck. So I have experience, firsthand experience with many of the issues specific to trucking. In the 1970s, trucking was still regulated by the Interstate Commerce Commission, and it was regulated as if it were a public utility providing a common good, a common service for all of the country. Made sense in lots and lots and lots of areas. There were also unbelievable amount of inefficiencies that were built into it. And, probably many of those inefficiencies that were built into it were probably done at the behest of the bigger players. But largely, that's the way trucking still works today. Most of it is small business, but those people that really have the influence to change policies are really still the big guys. We fight that all the time. But when it comes to, well, I guess my awareness or I guess introduction to this group was through Matt Stoller, who reached out when the supply chain problems first started popping up, maybe 6 months ago or longer now, but because he had heard what he'd heard many times throughout his life about a driver shortage. And, for pretty much all of the decades that our organization's been around, we've been saying the same thing. There's no shortage of people. The problems are elsewhere. When the ports were all backed up, what they were all saying is that we don't have drivers. We talk to those drivers. They say, wait a minute, we can't get loaded. We can't get unloaded. And what difference is, why would you want the supply chain lines of truckers to be even longer? Because we can't get it, we can't get in, we can't get out. There are problems in the ports. Some of those go to the longshoremen. One consistent complaint that we hear was that the hours that the port is open, they all shut down at the same time. Nobody works through lunch. Lunches are always an hour or longer. That's an issue that could remedy things, but a lot of these are certainly private entities, and the way deregulation impacted trucking, it changed the profession dramatically. Prior to that, it was hard to get a job as a truck driver. You went to work for bigger companies that generally operated in kind of a spoke and hub mechanism where drivers would go out several hundred miles, maybe 500 miles, and they would turn around and go back. And cargo would be shuttled all over the country like that. And, I don't think prior to deregulation, I don't think there was a single trucking company that had operating authority to go everywhere. once deregulation happened, everybody had authority to go everywhere just like that. And the players in what's called the truckload industry, they grew dramatically, and they grew dramatically generally with infusions of public money. They became stock investor companies. They grew rapidly. They went away from the mold of just having experienced drivers. They sought all the new people. All the new people, basically, they oftentimes trained them themselves. If they trained them at all, they trained quick, and they ran the country with them. And drivers, basically, they paid them all by the mile, and only pay by the mile. So that means the inefficiencies that take place at shippers and receivers, which are great. There have been studies done 20 years ago that said drivers would spend anywhere from 20 to as many as 44 hours per week just waiting to load or unload. Shocking amounts of time. And this is just time that drivers donate. And that is one of many reasons that we see all these ads for truck drivers wanted right now. I mean, there are plenty, but they leave almost as fast as they enter the industry. And there's nothing good about that. It makes our supply chain less resilient, less dependable, but it also makes it less safe. And of course, we've kind of reached the point where kind of the word is out. People aren't pursuing careers in trucking simply because it's not a career, unless for anyone other than somebody that wants to work 70 to 80 hours a week, every week for the rest of their lives and be away from home all the time. And pretty much the story's out on that. Some of the other costs that we've seen that were in essence passed on to the public through deregulation, there's no place for trucks to park right now. And this has been a major issue for over 2 decades. It's one that we communicate with lawmakers about it all the time. But I mean, if any of y'all drive around, you probably will see trucks parked on ramps and off ramps and all kinds of crazy places, because there's goods on those trailers that people want, but there's no place for the truck to park when the driver needs to stop to rest. And it is a major, major issue, and it's only getting worse. And of course, it is an issue that basically no one steps up to try to resolve. We have industrial areas that build up, retail areas that build up without a thought as to where all these trucks will need to be to do the loading and unloading. And this can be retail, this can be industrial. And when those kinds of thoughts are interjected into those kinds of conversations, what happens is the planners say, we're just going to go someplace else where we won't have to bother with these kinds of costs. And it's an absolute crazy situation. Again, and it's one, no one wants truck stops. These aren't necessarily considered all that desirable businesses by some people. It's the NIMBY stuff, but oftentimes in areas where truck stops would be needed the most, the value of the land is so much higher for other things that it's not terribly practical. But all of these things kind of get short shrift and the way the system right now, the way the system works right now. I was when we talked
I think you're lifting up such an important point, right? That it's not that there's a labor shortage; it's that there's a real shortage of good jobs and good trucking jobs in particular. And that failure, right? That is a failure of our public policy. That's a failure of our regulatory system. Is a real liability in our supply chains, right? Because if we can't get goods across the country, then our supply chains break down. And the only way we can get goods across the country is if we have real, folks who want to take on these jobs, to take on trucking. And I think it's really interesting. The Treasury Department released a report just earlier this week with a fascinating conclusion, which is that the lack of competition in labor markets drove down wages between 15 and 25%. So at the same time that concentration in labor markets is not giving people a choice to move to another job and sort of bargain their working conditions or wage up, it's also that same market power is being used to erode wages, to push people into independent contracting, and to misclassify workers, which to a large degree is, what's happened in trucking in parts of trucking. So I think this is a really important point, and thank you, Todd, for lifting that up for us. So I wanted to turn to you, Mike. You're a small business owner. You are subject in many ways to the whims of this system. So can you just talk a little bit about how the way our supply chain is currently set up affects you as a business owner? And have you been experiencing higher input costs as a result of the recent shifts in demand and supply shortages?
Yeah, hey, thanks for having me. So we definitely have experienced it. We have not been immune to it at all. Just a couple of examples that are at this point probably pretty well known by most of the people listening to this. Shipping prices have gone, anywhere between 300, 500, 600% up for us in just a couple of short years. We sell insulated drinkware, which usually is between $15 and $30. And so you're talking about a very material change in our cost structure. There's a general kind of rule if you are importing product, which is take whatever your cost increase is and multiply it by about 4. And that's pretty much what you have to do. So if your cost to transport an item goes up $1.50, you're probably talking about a $6 increase in retail just based on that. So we've seen a lot even recently this week, with Ukraine and the tragedy that's happening there and the explosion in nickel prices. Nickel is involved in stainless steel. And so stainless steel prices shot up 40% in like a matter of a couple of days. So we've seen it both in the cost to move things, but also we've seen it show up in that because the inputs for manufacturing have to be moved around, you just kind of have inflation happening at every stage in the process. And one of the things that I've seen is that, the worst pricing abuses, like the most egregious behavior tends to happen in these kind of environments. Because 2 reasons. One is that because when prices are kind of rising everywhere, everybody kind of tries to raise prices, whether or not it's justified. But also there's just more situations where you just don't have any options, and as a result of not having options, you end up having to take rates that are really disadvantageous. We'll say it that way. For us, we work with some of the biggest retailers in the world. We work with Amazon and Walmart and Target. And a lot of times we're selling programs that have a specific date that they need to be delivered and that they need to set. And so especially when we have to hit a certain deadline, we don't really have the ability to be as flexible sometimes in our options because we have more specifications that we have to meet. And so there have been some situations last year that we were kind of the victim of highway robbery, or I don't know what the nautical version of highway robbery is, but whatever it was, we were kind of exposed to it. One other point that I would make here that's pretty significant, I would not have seen this from the outside. So this is my first time to run an inventory business. What we tend to focus on how expensive the shipping has become. And that's certainly an issue, right? Like that translates directly into inflation for customers. But when you run an inventory business, a ton of your capital, most of my capital is actually tied up in inventory, right? And so a business like mine might have 3 to 4 months of inventory is what we typically try and carry. So we don't run out of stocks. We have what people need. Well, containers are now taking 2-3 times as much time to get over here. That on top of manufacturing delays means maybe now instead of 3 or 4 months of inventory, I have to carry 7 or 8 months of inventory. Okay, so why does that matter? Well, the reason it matters is that now I've got to pour $10 or $20 million in additional capital into just inventory for no other reason than I just can't get it here efficiently, right? So that's money I can't invest in jobs. That's money I can't invest in expansion or, new creation of new opportunities. Instead, we're literally talking about inventory that's just sitting on a ship somewhere that won't be sold for 7 or 8 months. So it's important for everyone to understand it isn't just the cost piece. The delays piece is just as costly to small business owners like myself.
Yeah, thank you for that. And actually, something you said towards the beginning of your remarks reminded me of this quote from an earnings call we heard I think it was just this month, from Hostess's CEO. They said, Pricing by definition is a change model. It's temporary. Consumers get used to it. When all prices goes up, it helps, right? Which is really them really acknowledging the fact that this current inflationary environment is a way for them to jack up prices. And small businesses are obviously bearing to some degree the brunt of that along with consumers. Mike, I just wanted to follow up on one other point. You mentioned that you're reliant on Amazon to a large degree to sell your goods. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship? I mean, Amazon's obviously this huge company, and you're one of many small ones. How does that power dynamic affect your business when you're dependent on this massive conglomerate for a marketplace?
Well, for sure. My job is kind of to try and build a brand and a company that is important enough and resilient enough that we're not commoditized by, kind of the corporate machines that exist. I think the senator spoke about this, and I've heard other people mention this. The incentive structure that our corporations run off of today, it is almost exclusively profit driven because it's almost exclusively shareholder driven. And I think you experience that working with the really large retailers. I would kind of describe them as they're amoral. They're not immoral. They're not moral. They're amoral. They're just profit driven because that's the incentive structure. And interestingly, they're full of great people that really do care and have really high values. But the overriding structure is how do you generate profits? And it can be problematic in a number of ways. I mean, one of the ways is that I am acutely aware that at any point, if I'm not deemed critical, to their success, that my business is going to get crushed in the process. So I have to build a business where they feel like they have to have our product, or they'll just find a cheaper alternative. They'll commoditize it. And I think that's obviously, there's a fear there that any small business owner, and I work with entrepreneurs. I teach at the local university. It's really part of my life mission is how do I encourage other entrepreneurs? And certainly it's a scary environment to be an entrepreneur in when you feel like it's so much easier to go take a job at JP Morgan where I know I'm going to make this salary than to try and do the much harder thing of kind of creating value and creating jobs and creating a business. When you hear stories of people that do work with a massive retailer or with a massive corporation and it goes poorly for them. So I think that's one of the things that I've noticed. I think in general, we are moving into, in my opinion, a phase where we're going to have to kind of evolve our perspective on capitalism. I'm very capitalistic, right? Like, obviously, I'm an entrepreneur, but I think we've kind of evolved into this form of capitalism where it's like the only stakeholder that matters is the shareholder. I think consumers really desperately want a version of capitalism where all the stakeholders matter, and that's the way that we try and think about it internally. And we try to be that kind of partners when we're working with Amazon and other people. Sometimes it's still a pretty transactional relationship, right? We can't force them to not be transactional, but the way that we respond to them, we can be non-transactional and trying to prioritize all the different stakeholders. So it's a challenge, but I think working up close with them, what I've really seen is it's more of a structural issue and where are the incentives, and that's and where are the guardrails also. This has been mentioned several times on this call, but there are places, and I've witnessed it firsthand, where without kind of public support, public funding, and guardrails, the system does break down, and I'm on the front lines of experiencing that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I really love that framing. Like, how do we make sure that the system works for all stakeholders, not just shareholders? I think that's, really at the crux of so many aspects of this conversation, which we're all coming at from really different places. So I did want to go to consumers next. You sort of teed us up, Mike. We've just covered a huge amount of ground. We've talked about all the ways that our supply chains are broken, all the ways that, concentrated private power is really taking a toll on small businesses and on our resiliency as a whole. And we've also talked about the need for investment in our supply chains and how that's such a necessary counterpoint to fixing some of the issues we're facing. So for anyone who would like to answer, I'll just start to open this up and hopefully we can just have a conversation. What's the upshot for consumers? I mean, we're all consumers in our day-to-day lives. How are all these issues that we're bringing up affecting consumers today?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to kind of jump in first on this, since I'm on the front lines, and really talking to customers and consumers on a daily basis. I mean, the first is it's just higher prices. Prices are going up. I wouldn't be surprised if there's even bigger numbers in the future. I know how our costs have gone up, and certainly it's double digits, the way that the inflation is kind of playing out, and we're really captive to that. But I think another dynamic that's dangerous in a situation like this is less competition. So sometimes you get less competition because of kind of predatory actions of the bigger companies, and sometimes you get less competition because the smaller companies just die out. We had a period in 2020 with the pandemic where you had more businesses created in the company than I think we've ever had on record. And 2021 was brutal. There were all kinds of new and unique companies, small businesses that were created during that period. And then they kind of have run into a brick wall. Especially, I do a lot of stuff in e-commerce. If you were running an e-commerce business, a combination of some changes that happened with Apple on iOS 14, plus the supply chain has just been brutal on trying to build a business. And so, the real risk for customers is higher prices and less choice. And then the final piece that I think we all have seen is, and sometimes you just can't get the product, right? The more fragile the system we have is, and the more dependencies it has, the more chance that at some point where you really need something, you can't get it. I mean, we all, as we went through the pandemic, there was this, moment of clarity and fear where we realized, hey, almost all of our antibiotics aren't even manufactured here. If we had to get, antibiotics, we couldn't even necessarily get some of the antibiotics that we need to get. So one of the ways we've responded to that personally is like, we're going to domestically manufacture. And we've invested several $1 million in building manufacturing here. I think part of the answer here is obviously supply chain. And part of this is just as a country, we need to embrace making more of the things that we need. You can never be fully secure, right? You can never fully solve for this problem unless you're willing to make more of the products that you use domestically. And then, I think the downside is that all of this inflation, it impacts less affluent Americans more disproportionately. It's just the reality. And so we really have this kind of company mission statement. We exist to give generously. And one of the ways we try and do that is pricing. And it's really hard when we're trying to give the most generous pricing possible to our customers. And we see our input costs go up, $2, $3, which leads to all this inflation for the people that we're serving.
Matt, I'm wondering if you want to comment on this question as well.
Sure. Yeah. So I think at a kind of broad level, I think what we're realizing is that the way that we kind of set up our markets and set up our supply chains was kind of at a bargain. So we gave up a lot of power to corporations and big business to do that structuring work. And in return, the idea was that we would get lower prices for consumers. And I think what this kind of episode in the last few years is showing is that kind of bargain maybe wasn't so sustainable. And I think, Rakeem, you and David Dayan have a fantastic intro to the Prospect series that I really recommend that people check out. It's kind of, summarizing this bargain. In rail, just real quick, I'll say that, deregulation did lead to lower prices when deregulation first started. But part of this came from shutting down routes to unprofitable places that I think you can now argue are left behind communities. And part of it also came from cutting workers. And then, as railroads kind of amassed a lot of power and Wall Street pushed them to kind of use that power, prices went back up. And so I think in the short term, we're kind of realizing that we gave up that power. But also I think we're part of kind of mobilizing to realize that we can also start to make sense of how this unaccountable private power in a kind of all a range of areas of our life could be restructured to be more sustainable and I think prosperous for like everyone, not just the big businesses.
Thanks for that. I know we want to keep this conversation going, but of course we are always limited in time. So I thought we could go around just one more time around the horn and talk about solutions, right? We've raised a lot of problems and I'm just wondering, maybe starting with you, Todd, what should we do about this? I think you need to unmute.
I muted myself. It's ironic because, again, transportation is such a big industry. And as been pointed out here, our whole country is totally dependent on transportation, and finding the ways to make it more efficient will benefit everyone. Having said that, most of trucking is small business, and most of the policymakers really in trucking aren't the small guys, they're the big guys. And oftentimes our folks would be complaining about regulations that basically don't really serve any purpose other than making it more difficult for small guys. And we see focus on big when we followed closely the infrastructure bill that was passed. And as I look at it in regard to where priorities are, we were frustrated in that lawmakers didn't do anything to address the parking issue that our folks, or most of truckers, struggle with every night. But they did address things like dredging certain harbors deeper and things like that, to where even bigger container ships can handle these ports. And I'm thinking, why? We have lots and lots and lots of ports right now that are underutilized, and they can't accommodate the biggest ships, but do they need to? Why would we not utilize greater utilization of more ports in more places would reduce congestion? I think it would speed up the turnover of goods going in and out. And you know, we hear about agricultural goods basically being blown off in this environment right now, where basically the ocean shippers are really they're really cashing in.
Thanks. Dr. Chua, maybe we'll go to you next. What should we do about this big supply chain problem we're all facing?
Yeah, an easy question to answer. I guess I'll just start by saying that the supply chain problem is not just a question of demand and supply, as many of us have pointed out. It's a political issue. And so, US economic policy currently facilitates that consolidation and monopoly and private sector control of so many segments of the supply chain, means that the administration has very few short-term solutions to that supply chain crunch. So there needs to be sort of longer-term planning around a supply chain that is more resilient and less fragile. And I should also say that, part of this is not just a natural process of globalization or technological innovation. If these trends were similar around the world, big companies would have all sort of had the similar kinds of patterns of consolidation. But if you look at big companies in Europe over the last 50 years, they've only become slightly bigger as opposed to much larger in the US, and with a huge change in prices versus labor cost. And the EU has kept competition alive, in part by blocking mergers and allowing things like infrastructure shared use rights for smaller companies. And so I think in the US, one of the biggest challenges now is going to be passing several bills in Congress that are currently at the level of the House: the structural separation bill, the enforcing monopolies, what is it called? The Ending Platform Monopolies Act. Many of these acts that are aimed at trying to break up massive companies like Amazon, many of whom sort of hide their profits within tax avoidance and with ways of exploiting monopoly to crowd out competition. I'll finally say that, an NYU economist, Thomas Philippon, recently estimated that consolidation has reduced a typical family's economic outcomes by $5,000. So even as we talk about things like how consumers are affected by rising prices, we also have to recognize that wages have stagnated as those prices have increased. So supporting and being in solidarity with workers' movements who are across the nation fighting for unions at a scale never before seen, I think will be crucial. And the last thing I'll say is that although this seems like a far off premise, we're increasingly seeing supply chain fragilities also exacerbated by unpredictable climate change. And so the ways in which we rely on fossil fuels and the ways in which we are suffering from a kind of reliance on a massive global economic system that requires constant growth and constant economic output requires, I think, that we ask some bigger questions about what it might look like to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, to think about renewable energy sources, and to answer, I think, the most important sort of urgent question that we face, not just supply chains, but climate change.
I see Todd wanted to respond to that, so I'll turn it over to you, Todd.
Not necessarily respond to that, but it dawned on me that I missed the most obvious thing that, that is responsible for many inefficiencies that specifically involve truck drivers. As I said earlier, and I want to emphasize this point, the vast majority of truck drivers are only paid for miles driven, nothing for their time. And I mentioned earlier that some spend 40 hours a week just waiting to try to get loaded and unloaded. And the only reason they spend that time is because it's donated. It doesn't cost anyone in the supply chain anywhere. If that inefficiency were addressed, those hours that are wasted right now would be fewer. And I should also point out that when you're only paid for miles driven, the incentive will always be, I want to drive more miles. Maybe I want to drive more miles faster. Maybe I want to drive more. Maybe I'm going to have to drive maybe when it's not really safe to drive because of lousy weather. The incentives are not really where they need to be for truckers right now. And that shouldn't be overlooked.
Thanks for that, Todd. Mike, I'll go to you next. What should we do to fix the supply chain problem?
Yeah, so I would focus, I'll tell you what I'm doing. The first thing is we need to make more things domestically. We just need to do that. And, one of the ways that you reduce the strain on the supply chain is that less of your consumption has to be, shipped internationally. It's a pretty straightforward proposition. And especially if you want robust, listen, this situation with Ukraine is, I think, in some ways a harbinger of like what could and probably will happen with other, trading partners. Like there is going to continue to be disruption. The more that we can competently and at a high level of quality produce domestically, the stronger we're going to be. As an economy, the more robust it's going to be. I think another point that's been made is that, I heard a simple principle: the more efficient or optimized a system is, the more fragile it is. The reason why we fundamentally don't have the robustness that we would want in the supply chain, the reason why it's fragile, is because we have not been willing to pay what it would take. It's that simple. We wanted low prices. And I think, especially as I spend time with students, one thing that's encouraging that I can say is that it's the most values motivated generation we've ever had. Like they really are willing to pay more to understanding the comprehensive of what they get isn't just the product, it's also the company they support and the process that the product was made through and the kind of ethics that went behind that. And I think as a country, we have to make a trade-off decision of we are willing to build excess capacity that won't always be used, but we're ready for when things don't go as planned. And we're willing to put our money where our mouth is when it comes to some of the values that if you took Gallup polls people would say they really support. And maybe some of that is education. It's helping people to understand that when you pick up that item that's $4.99 instead of the item that's $5.99, there were some corners that were cut and some things that probably happened in the process of making that item and getting it to market that you wouldn't love, right? And maybe that's part of the answer is helping to educate consumers, because I do think the average consumer, if they really understood all of the things that went into the products that they buy, I think it would alter their buying decisions. And ultimately, you can have the lowest prices in the world, or you can have robustness in your supply chain and more ethical behavior, but you probably can't have both. And as a country, I think we need to kind of choose, hopefully we're choosing the path where what we stand for is more than just what price gets me the most of things.
Thanks, Mike. And then Matt, last but certainly not least, do you want to answer our question around what we should do about this big problem?
Definitely. Thanks, Rakeen. So I think I want to just go on something that Mike said, which is that, I think for however much this supply chain crisis is really, bad and, not great, I think there's an exciting silver lining in that what Mike said is that this is a really values motivated kind of era, and that people are kind of recognizing that, economics is not simply economics, but it's political and it's a choice about the type of society we want to live in. More concretely, I think one of the things I mentioned in my article is that I think we need to do the work to kind of think about possibly re-regulating the railroad industry and other essential infrastructure industries. Because I think, for something as important as the railroads, we might want to put back a lot of public obligations that they used to have. At a broader level, I think administratively, we need to talk about how to bring in values like non-domination, resiliency, productive efficiency, and bring those all together and realize that low price isn't the be-all end-all of policy. And then politically, I think that, Sarah Miller and Faz Shakir put out a paper in Democracy Journal recently. I think it makes a really good case that we also just politically need to be unapologetically fervent about using the public power for the public good. And I think that's going to be key for making sure that whatever changes and policies come out of this are lasting, so that there's a working class small business kind of farmer coalition that can really make, again, lasting change.
Thanks, Matt. And huge thanks to all of our panelists today, Todd, Matt, Mike, and Dr. Chua. I think this conversation has been so rich, and I wish it could go on forever, because maybe not forever. One day we'll solve these problems and we won't have to have these conversations. But, it's really clear to me that what we have is a system that big companies have built to work for them and not for any of us, right? And as we're seeing the pandemic and increasingly climate shocks hit our supply chains, we're seeing straight up how not resilient that system is. And all of us are paying the price, right? Whether that's workers, whether that's independent truck drivers, whether that's consumers, whether that's small businesses, all of us are paying the price for that power imbalance. And this conversation, I think, really illuminated all the ways that that's happening. So huge gratitude to the entire panel for joining us today. And to wrap us up, I will turn it back over to Sarah Miller, and take it away, Sarah.
Thanks, Joaquin. Yeah, I think there are so many pearls of wisdom throughout this entire event. I just want to take a minute to thank Groundwork, to thank Dave Dan and the American Prospect, to thank all of our kind of friends here on this panel who we've learned so much from. I do think, hopefully we are at this moment where we are starting to build and accelerate what is truly an intellectual movement, a grassroots movement to change the way that government institutions interact with corporate power. I think at the end of this 40-year experiment where we have outsourced so much of our manufacturing in the ways that we make things, where we have allowed power to consolidate and concentrate, which we've kind of done, under the guise of lowering consumer prices. I think, Joaquin, in your piece, there was a great little phrase about, maybe you can pick up a $5 pair of tube socks at Walmart, but, your pay is down, your community is hollowed out, our politics are so broken, and there's, very few opportunities to start and grow a business. So I am optimistic. I think the collective wisdom of the folks on this panel and in this community has been put to good use today. And I'm so grateful for all of your time and for all that I personally have learned from you. And let's move on forwards to identify, advocate for, and implement bold solutions that will meet this moment. So this is a problem that we don't have in the future. Thanks again, and thanks to all of the audience for joining us today. And do pick up the issue of the American Prospect that Groundwork partnered on supply chains. Please give it a read. Thanks all.